Hello, my name is Dr. Dorian Brown Crosby, and I'm a political scientist at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Because of INCOPES, I am connected to a strong network of resources and friends. We invite you to join us so that you can do the same. Please consider joining the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, or INCOPES. We invite you to join us because we are excited about the expertise and passion you'll bring to our organization. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, the incoming president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. I am a political scientist at the University of California, Irvine. Because of NCOPES, I know that I am a member of an organization where my principles and values are shared. When I ask my research questions about Black survival in the NCOPE space, people sit up, take notice, and listen instead of closing their minds, their eyes, and their ears. I hope you'll join us as a member of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists so that we can help you develop your passion and your expertise. We are here to build, we are here to lift, we are here to transform and get free.
Because of INCOPES, our world is a better place. And many of you know this is not an exaggeration. As an organization, a community, and even a family, we provide support to one another in the development of the production of knowledge and the development of important theoretical foundations for the examination of really crucial political issues. From our seasoned to our newer scholars and everyone in between, we see the sharing of perspectives and research, the challenging of ideas, and the supporting of dynamic scholarship and mentorship. Because of NCOPES, I have cherished colleagues across the nation who understand the specific experiences of Black political scientists within many different types of organizations and institutions. And we are able to build one another up and share best practices. I really, really appreciate the opportunities that are available through this community for interaction and growth and caring and sharing. And I encourage you to encourage others to join and support NCOPES. My name is Dr. Jessica Carew, and I'm a political scientist at Elon University. Join NCOPES. We are here to help, here to build, and here to get free. Join us. We welcome your expertise and passion.
On that note, I guess we will get going. Welcome to this roundtable on COVID-19 and the Black community, or Black communities, plural, since we're not monolithic. My name is Julia Jordan-Zachary. I am the chair and professor of Africana Studies at UNC Charlotte, and I basically cut my teeth as a political scientist at NCOPES, and I'm able to sustain the work I do because of NCOPES. So today, as I mentioned, we are here to have what I know will be an amazing conversation on COVID-19 and Black communities. We are joined by a number of our esteemed scholars who have been doing really critical work, pushing us to think really hard on how we're understanding not just the politics of a pandemic, but also the response of coming from Black communities. And so it is truly an honor for me to stare at this panel very loosely defined. I'm here to just keep time and make sure that we have a good conversation, right? Which is what I'm hoping that we all have. So each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to share their thoughts. And I am a big fan of allowing people to introduce themselves because they know themselves best. I mean, I think I know some of you and I have great things to say about the work that you're doing. And but don't be shy, because if you're shy in introducing yourself, then I have to jump in and say, but remember. And so we are going to start with Dr. Tucker-Worgs, then move to Dr. Brown-Dean. I believe we're going to see the video from Dr. Spence. And then I will pull up the rare, opening up for conversation. So having said that, let us commence on what I know will be a rich conversation. Oh, before I forget, I'll let you know when you have when 8 minutes have expired, and then when you have 2 minutes left. Okay, I'll let you know that.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for that introduction. I didn't know I was going to have to introduce myself, but I'll try. I'm Tamelyn Tucker-Worgs. I am an associate professor at Hood College. I'm also the chair of the political science department, and I'm the Virginia Lewis Professor of Political Science at Hood College as well. I too have cut my teeth on NCOPES way back in undergrad. When I was an undergrad at Hampton University, I attended my first NCOPES. And so some people I met then and still know today. And so, you know, this is just such a special moment for me. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, this year's co-organizers, for coming up with this idea to have a panel about COVID and pushing it forward and organizing this roundtable. It's such an important topic. And I'm honored to be on this panel with Dr. Jordan-Zachary and Dr. Brown-Dean and Dr. Spence. I mean, it's just really an honor for me, and I'm looking forward to an important conversation that we'll have after the remarks. And I'm going to try to stay in 10 minutes, but please, you know, stop me or let me know when I'm getting too much over. Okay. All right. So I'm going to focus my remarks on Black people and Black churches in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. I study Black churches. And so COVID-19 has disrupted and transformed the lives of people all over the world. In the United States, and we know this, almost 30 million people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus, and there have been over 500,000 deaths. And as it happens, the coronavirus pandemic is revealing and also exacerbating existing inequalities as Black people are contracting, being hospitalized, and dying from the disease at alarmingly higher rates than the general population. When thinking about Black people also lag behind testing and are also lagging behind in vaccinations. And so, for example, in Maryland, where I am right now, where I live, as of March 1st, only 17% of those who had received the vaccination were Black, whereas Black people are about 30% of the population here in Maryland. Furthermore, 36% of those who died from COVID and 33% of those who were diagnosed with cases of COVID were Black in Maryland. That's also as of March 1st. All this to say is that there are severe, enduring, predictable, I would say, racial, gender, age, and class-based and other-based disparities regarding how people are faring during the coronavirus pandemic. For Black people, traditionally, Black churches, and like Julia, the Black church is not a monolith, so I'm going to try to say Black churches have served as important resources for navigating crises and facilitating community engagement. These institutions are not a monolith. They vary in terms of what they do, how they carry out their social, political, and theological work. However, Black churches, I would argue, are our most enduring institutions. The coronavirus pandemic, however, has laid out some serious challenges for the churches as institutions and how they function, and also how they operate in a time when their services are increasingly needed. So for some, they're battling with their very survival. as institutions. And I want to turn to talk briefly about 3 of the major challenges that Black churches have faced during the coronavirus pandemic. First, churches had to close their physical buildings. They could not host services in person or any other activities in person. So as you can imagine, the impact of this is far reaching. First, they had to figure out how to hold church services and meet the needs, the spiritual needs of their members. This includes worship services on Sundays, but also all the ways that churches engage in religious rites and practices. And so when you think about marriages, birth, death, especially death. And as we've had this unprecedented number of deaths this past year with the COVID-related deaths, in addition to other deaths, people have not been able to rely on churches and clergy or each other in the same ways, church members relying on each other to help them through the grieving process in the ways that they may have been able to during non-COVID times. So as we have been as we have been, during this time when people are transitioning, the normal burial and grieving rituals have been interrupted. People haven't been able to fellowship in the same way due to social distancing, and this has become more critical as people are experiencing isolation, maybe depression because of the social distancing requirements so that we can stay safe. So secondly, Black churches are voluntary organizations, staffed mostly by unpaid, disproportionately women volunteers, funded mostly by donations in the form of tithes and offerings. And so closing physically meant that many of them have experienced fundraising challenges and also have lost access to much of their volunteer labor force due to restrictions stemming from the pandemic. Third, closing their physical church doors meant that they also had to suspend much of their community outreach work. So in a survey of 249 churches where we were asking about their responses to COVID that we conducted last fall, my colleague Tucker-Worgs and I found that when churches closed their physical doors, the actual physical doors of the church edifice, they also suspended many community outreach services, at least for a sizable portion of the time that we have been experiencing the coronavirus pandemic. So just to run down a listing, and I didn't leave my listing, so I'm just gonna have to remember, of the things that they had to stop doing, things like feeding people, feeding programs, clothing programs, college readiness programs, tutoring, childcare, all of these activities, prison ministries, homeless ministries, these activities were halted or at least temporarily due to the coronavirus pandemic. So next I want to comment also briefly about how Black churches have responded and are continuing to respond to the challenges brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. So the impact and then how they've responded. So I want to do it in threes again. So at first, as far as worship services, most Black churches have utilized technology and moved to a virtual format. They are holding virtual worship services, Bible studies, ministry meetings, and prayer meetings through conference calls, Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, and other streaming services. For some larger churches that are better resourced, this has been more of a seamless transition as they were already doing some of these types of worship practices already, but for others, it's been a heavier lift and a more major cultural shift. And so also the digital divide challenge still exists where some don't have access to the internet or computer technology. And so particularly for seniors, even if they have access, they might not have the, be able to actually work the technology. So in addition to virtual formats, some churches use other kind of social distance solutions where they had drive-in services and things like that. Also, they increased their efforts to reach out to people who may feel isolated. They may have started daily meditations or prayer calls or touch base with members more frequently. Some churches were also were able to restart some of their outreach programs, adhering to social distance guidelines and other safety guidelines. Some churches reported actually increasing their outreach and starting new areas of outreach to meet the increasing community demand brought on by the coronavirus pandemic, such as distributing gift cards, PPE, food, voting information to the communities, and some developed virtual education programs, college tours, virtual college tours, tutoring, and other youth programs. Black churches also engaged in community outreach that directly addressed the coronavirus pandemic by serving as testing sites, particularly partnering with organizations that were trying to address testing disparities. And we've really seen this with the vaccine rollout, where churches have, I'll just give one example, like the Second Episcopal District of the AME Church, which is Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. They have several churches throughout the district that are serving as vaccination sites with the goal of closing the vaccination gap and getting more Black people vaccinated. And it's a coordinated effort throughout the district. The most interesting observation about these churches is that we all know within the context of COVID-19 pandemic, we've also seen what some are calling the racial reckoning or a double pandemic, but massive protests throughout the nation, actually the world, to protest anti-Blackness and in support of Black lives, particularly in reaction to the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others this past spring. So Black churches, even within the context of the pandemic, have also tried to address this issue. And I just want to say that 85% of the churches that we interviewed said that they responded to Black Lives Matter in some way. And so we asked them, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen the outbreak of massive protests in response to the recent police killings. Has your church done anything in any way? And they reported a number of ways that they engaged through Bible study, sermons, prayer services. Others said that their pastors or members had participated in discussions or forums focused on Black Lives Matter or otherwise advocated for Black Lives Matter. Another observation, my last observation is that this very contentious election in 2020, where voter suppression tactics were on full display, and as we know, the election provided a special set of circumstances where people are trying to vote safely during the pandemic. And the elections included an attack on mail-in and absentee voting, and that disproportionately impacted Black voters. And activist Black churches have traditionally done voter education and voter registration, get out the vote campaign. And I just wanted to say that 96% of our churches that we surveyed claim to have done some of this work, even in the midst of the pandemic. So ranging from just encouraging people to vote, to doing voter registration drives, to establishing voter hotlines, and helping people with early mail-in and absentee voting. And my final thought is that yesterday March 11th, marked 1 year since the coronavirus was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, and Sunday will mark 1 year since most Black churches closed their doors of their church edifice due to the pandemic. And I want to leave us with this question regarding Black churches and COVID-19, is what will the post-COVID Black church look like? And I can explain more about what I mean by that in questions and answers, but I think we should kind of think about that. What will this church look like post-COVID? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for posing that question. You are leaving us on the cliff. Lots to think about. And so now we turn over to Dr. Brown-Dean.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jordan-Zachary. It's hard to follow Dr. Tucker-Worgs, but I will do my part to continue the conversation. And good afternoon to my INCOPES family. I wish we could be in person to lay eyes on one another and give that reassuring nod that we always get at INCOPES to continue. I want to acknowledge that while yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of the world shutting down, so to speak, that this weekend will mark the 1 year anniversary since Breonna Taylor was killed. And so those dual realities of knowing that a police officer was charged for shooting a wall, but not killing a Black woman, helps us understand the framework of why understanding the impact of COVID-19 on Black communities is so important. and why it is at the center of the work that has been done by INCOPE scholars for years. Those dual pandemics help us to understand that public policy never happens in a vacuum. And the lived experiences of Black people across this country are always at the intersections of other people deciding our worth, even as we rebel against it. And so I think that that exclusion, that systematic exclusion of Black voices, the denial of Black worth, is really why we have seen the kinds of outcomes that we have seen related to COVID-19, so that no one that I know was surprised by the disparities. It affirmed what we already knew, but it also was frustrating because we have known for decades that public education or education in general in this country was not working for Black and brown children. We have known that that technical divide, that inability to have access to technology is having an impact on families and children, who then get painted as being deficient because people have not realized that you can give a kid a Chromebook, but if they don't have high quality Wi-Fi at home, it is nothing more than a paperweight. As we think about people who are waiting to look at their checking accounts to see whether that next stimulus check will hit, in spite of the rhetoric that says people will just waste it, we know that there are people who have delayed not just paying their bills, but delayed buying medication or buying food, because what some people see as $1,400 not being much, other people acknowledge that it's not enough, but it is more than what I have right now. That is the reality in which Black people have been saying, not just this past year, but for really our first presence in this country, that if you do not address the depths of that challenge, then we will always find ourselves having a debate about the next pandemic and what should be done. And at the core of all of that is a question of vulnerability. So Ray Block Jr. and I, Ray Block Jr. of Penn State University, have a new book that is under contract with Cambridge University Press. And that book is called Protesting Vulnerability, Race and Pandemic Politics. And in the book, we argue that the link between race and public safety forces communities to navigate multiple overlapping and simultaneous threats to their very existence. And that disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, coupled with police violence, is yet another manifestation of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. We have known that there are disparities in access to healthcare. We have known that even when Black folks are able to access health, that our experiences and our outcomes are quite different, that it is not simply an issue of class. It is not simply people not knowing the importance of healthy eating. It is about what happens when brown bodies present themselves before people who are in positions of authority and they deem that brown body as deficient. How else could we explain hearing a Black woman doctor who was trained better than the people who were supposed to deliver care to her, hearing her beg for her life and say, this is not right? And that means then that vulnerability that can result in the loss of life is what we see with COVID-19 and what we see in so many other dimensions. When we talk about Black politics, we draw the inspiration for our book and for our notion of COVID-19 as a manifestation of state-sanctioned violence from the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, because her work reminds us that racism exploits communities who are already vulnerable to premature death. And so it is nice that people are able to point out now what we have always known about that access to health and those disparities. But it also means that we cannot take for granted the importance of representation and having voices at the table who are willing to call a thing a thing. One of the things that we opened with when we were writing our book proposal, and I will say that at that time, I remember Ray and I having to go back and think, okay, by the time this proposal is read, we may be closer to 200,000 deaths. So we need to think about that in our language. And here we are now with over 500,000 people having lost their lives, primarily people who look like us, having lost their lives, families who are forever touched because of that. And so we think about that, whether death is the result of a global pandemic, whether that comes as the result of heightened mental health trauma, or the callous indifference to seeing a man beg for his life for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there is a community-wide impact of that violence. And so when you have a US Surgeon General named Jerome Adams at the time, who gives this speech saying to Black people, I need you to do it for your big mama. I need you to do it for your abuelo. It is so condescending to do that because it assumes that people don't already know the suffering that they are experiencing. We have everything that we need for our communities to thrive if some folks just get out of the way and allow that to happen. And so with all of that being said, in terms of that broader socioeconomic and political context, we bring together these two streams because a lot of the data that we have, the public opinion data about why people were participating in the marches and in the movement for Black lives, it was never just about a movement for Breonna Taylor or just a movement for Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the countless other names that we may not know, but whose families experience. It was also about a movement for Tatiana Jefferson, who a year before that was shot and killed in her own home. It was a movement for Botham Jean, who was killed in his home by a woman who claimed that he was an intruder into her apartment, even though she was on the wrong floor and was a police officer. People were willing to risk their lives and their health in the middle of a whole pandemic because they understood that the status quo was already a daily risk to their lives and to their safety. I want to share with you a quote from a young woman who was participating in one of the marches. And the question to her was why she was willing to risk her health and safety in order to be a part of that march. And she said, we're organizing for our lives. We have to live, so we're not going to live under somebody's boot. And that comment sent me chills. Thank you. I see your hand. Sent chills because it was the fact that this young woman, 20 years old, was willing to risk her life because she understood that the other option was the same thing. So whether she made the choice to put her health at risk or someone else decided she wanted to be a part of that and do something in the affirmative. And in spite of that, in spite of all of that collective trauma, in spite of young people being disconnected from their schools, not only did people march and organize and strategize, they also turned out to vote in the highest rates we have ever seen. Black folks did that. Brown folks did that together, not because of a political party or because of a candidate, but because the status quo was literally killing us. And so, and I have 1 minute left or 2 minutes left. I don't want to get in trouble with the timekeeper. In the 1 minute that we have left, let me say a couple of things quickly about where we go from here and things that we need to think about. I'm sure that all of you, like I am sick and tired of
You're frozen. I don't know if you can hear us. So let's give Dr. Brown-Dean a little moment, see if she gets this message that she's frozen. And of course, she can have her time back to give what I felt was like, you know, when the preacher stands up and the sermon is just getting going when it's at the end. So we really want that part of the service. So we'll let her come back on. Dawn, do you have by any chance? Okay, she's coming back. She's coming back. All right, girl, we were waiting for the end of that sermon.
Listen, everybody in my house is on Zoom. My kids in school, my husband's at work. So this is the reality that we have. Let me get this point out because I don't know when, the Wi-Fi will decide to go again.
Right, go ahead.
But I just wanted to say very quickly, as we think about the next steps, and as much as we all want to go back to normal, we also have to acknowledge that normal was not working for many communities, especially our own. So we should think about what are the innovations that can come out of this. When it comes to education, watch for the private charter school corporations that will try to swoop in and change that and imperil the access for all of us. Watch who has access to vaccines and watch about who will have access to the capital that is needed to continue their businesses now that we have lost over 40% of Black-owned small businesses. If that is the commitment to moving forward, that's where we need to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I told you the end of that sermon was going to be good. That's why we waited. No. But thank you. Thank you again. See, this is what makes NCOPES, right? These types of questions that we're kind of tasked with thinking about. So I'm going to turn it over to Dawn, I believe, who might have the recording from Dr. Spence.
Hey, I've been asked to talk about the political dynamics of COVID for NCOPES, just in case something goes wrong with the Zoom technology. So what I want to do is talk about a few different things related to the neoliberal turn, the thing I've been writing about for the past almost decade. For those of you who don't know, when I talk about the neoliberal turn, I'm talking about basically a turn towards a suite of policies that significantly distribute wealth and political power upwards. It's responsible for significantly increasing wealth inequality. We have higher levels of wealth inequality now than we did during the Great Depression. And in as much as this is NCOPES, we have higher levels of wealth inequality within Black communities than white ones. So when I talk about the neoliberal turn, I'm talking about a set of policies that basically accomplish this end. It reduces the ability of labor to organize. It increases capital mobility. It reduces the ability of government to provide social services and to collect taxes for that purpose. It significantly increases the scope and the scale of the carceral state. What else does it do? It privatizes a range of public services, and it renders, it peels back a number of public government elements in favor of kind of more technocratic ones. And I think, if I haven't mentioned it already, I think I did, but it significantly reduces the scale and scope of the welfare state. Now, how do we use those dynamics to explain the coronavirus or the response to the coronavirus? Well, I will say that at the outset, we have to add one more element. We can't explain the rise of Trump, the Trump tendency through the neoliberal turn, or we can explain his rise. We could probably explain his rise in as much as he comes out of New York, and New York had a certain type of austerity politics that takes shape as he comes to power within New York as a developer, but his political tendency is a bit different, right? So what I'm going to do is, because I don't have a lot of time, what I'm going to suggest is that his presidency, his administration represents kind of a revanchist fight against the city that is in some ways a response to the neoliberal turn, some ways a byproduct, but it's not fully related. It's not fully it doesn't fully come out of the neoliberal turn. So maybe I'll come back to that at the end. We'll see. So how can we use these dynamics to explain health disparities, or to explain the fact that in my own personal case, I think I know approximately 16 people to die from COVID, including one of my college girlfriend's dad, including one of my high school classmates' 5-year-old daughter, and then several others. All those folk were Black, except I knew one person, a white brother in Baltimore, got really, really sick. But I think every death that I experienced, directly or indirectly, was Black. Also, though, I think every death I experienced directly or indirectly was also in Detroit. So what's going on there? So one argument that people can make is that Black people are predisposed to have a number of pre-existing conditions. Like, we're more likely to have heart conditions, more likely to have stress, more likely to have a range of conditions. And we know that the people who are most likely to die from COVID had comorbidities. So part of it's that. But the other part of it, I think, is the response is that apparatus I talked about. So here's one way to think about it. When I was at the early stages, and when I had to go out to get to grocery shop for my kids, for my family, I went to two places. I went to the Target and I went to the Giant. Both those places, 90 to 95% of the employees were Black, even though I don't live in an area that's 90, 95% Black. When I would go every now and then to a grocery store up the street, a little bit further up, I remember seeing a line of drivers, because that's when, a lot of people were having their groceries delivered. 20 people in line waiting to pick up stuff to deliver. I think 19 of them were Black. So how do we think about this from a labor perspective? I just said that earlier that one of the dynamics of the neoliberal turn is it reduces the ability of labor to organize. So the reduction of the ability of labor to organize reduces the ability of workers to get the type of benefits they need in order to take care of what health issues they may have, and then in order to get the care that they need in order to either prevent them from getting COVID or to perhaps to take care of them if they end up coming down with it. I noted that it reduces the reduces the scope and the scale of the welfare state. A number of nations basically paid their workers to stop working, paid just chunks of this, gave them checks to stay home. The workers that I'm talking about, the people at the grocery stores, the people at Target, all those Black folk, none of them could stay home. They had to work. So if they have to work, that means they had to consistently be involved with folk. They have to consistently put themselves at risk. One of the things that the neoliberal turn does, I talked about it from the standpoint of public policy, but if we think about it as kind of as an attempt to rewire individuals to make them more responsible for their own circumstances, how can we use that dynamic to explain what happened? What was the major policy idea that came out of the United States, or that came out of the federal government, or I'm sorry, government at different levels, because we don't really have anything coming from the federal government in the form of the president? What was the one thing? People were talking about masks. What is the mask? The mask is an individual item of clothing that protects you as the individual and then those around you from either getting it or spreading it. Think about the language that was used. Think about how you felt the first time you were in a space in which everybody is expected to wear masks, but there was one or two people who didn't. Think about how you felt when the Republican Party actually articulated an anti-mask policy at the local, state, and the federal level. As problematic as that was, and that was incredibly problematic, the dynamic here was still about individual responsibility. where other countries that had a different orientation, that weren't quite as neoliberal as us, they were literally paying people to stay home. Everybody, we were focused on masks. Think about that. Now, if we just take those dynamics, I'll add one more. There's a city dynamic to it. So in New York City was one of the first cities that was hardest hit. Under Cuomo alone, Cuomo cut the number of public hospital beds in half. Now, the thing is if you look at New York City, going back to the early 70s, when New York City was hard hit by the austerity policy, one of the first attempts to kind of roll out the neoliberal turn in America, they were privatizing hospitals and getting rid of them left and right. Cutting the number of hospital beds in half end up killing folk. We know that that there are two populations who are most likely to die from COVID. Moving outside the race for a second. One is folks with pre-existing health issues, and the other is the elderly. We're talking about elderly care units. Elderly care units are often private units, loosely regulated by the state. Under that dynamic, it's no surprise that we see a significant rise in the deaths of the elderly. Again, because our public infrastructure to deal with that is basically withered away as a result of the neoliberal turn. So if we talk about the health disparities, COVID and other things, with those things in mind, thinking about labor, thinking about the resources that the state has, thinking about how care is individualized, I think that gets us away from this idea that Black people are somehow genetically different and that perhaps Black people suffer from something like trauma going back to slavery, as opposed to being in cities and neighborhoods and states that's basically had the public and the idea of the public stripped from them. On that note, I think I'm out. Peace.
Lots to think about there. Lots to think about this neoliberal turn and what it means for how we engage with COVID, particularly looking at it from a labor perspective and what the neoliberal turn does for those of us who are caught up in capitalism. And so now let me be honest with my time. Sorry, just give me a minute to get the clock going. And so I want to start first by simply recognizing those of us who have been harmed directly and indirectly as a result of COVID, and also recognizing those who have lost their lives, both within the US and outside of the US, and the impact, both long and short term, that we will experience. And so just take a quick moment to recognize all of the pain and suffering. Ashe. Thanks to the organizers for putting this panel together. And today I want to talk just briefly about power pandemics, a reflection on Black women's mourning during this time. And I start with an African proverb that reads, "If you hide a sick person, your lamentation alarm will only announce his death," end quote. 2019, I was on the beach in Barbados when I got a text message that read, "Don't come back. The virus is all over this place." I had to reread this text as I was a bit clueless as to what my friend was warning me against. I was in Barbados filming a documentary titled Healing Roots. And I was so caught up with this project that I'd paid minimum attention to the news. Yes, my temperature had been checked when I first arrived home, but I had quickly put that out of my mind, given my attention to this documentary. Days away from returning, I contemplated my friend's warning. I started following the news. Across social media and other platforms, I read, "Oh, it doesn't impact Black people." Eventually, I would read and hear and read, COVID-19 is a great equalizer. As a Black woman, these statements made me pause. As a Black woman who is a social scientist, these statements brought a longer pause. As a Black granddaughter, daughter, and mother, these statements made me panic. Across all of my identities, I knew that these statements would prove false. I could not predict this current impact, but I knew. Eventually, headlines from various parts of the world would read, and I quote, "Young mother faces eviction, welfare office appeals to landlord, Barbados. Black minority women in Canada left behind in COVID-19 job recovery. Opinion, facing both COVID-19 and racism, Black women are carrying a particularly heavy burden, Washington Post. High case count among Black residents in Mecklenburg, a major problem, some leaders say, Charlotte, North Carolina, where I am. COVID-19 and Black female workers on the front line. This was an article from a United Kingdom newspaper. Regardless of where you read, the headlines from various countries show that COVID-19 is anything but an equalizer. And we know that COVID-19 can impact anyone, but it does not suggest equality. As beautifully laid out by my colleagues, Black and brown folk have been disproportionately harmed. So I will not recount the numbers. Instead, today I want to talk about power pandemics and particularly mourning. What do I mean by power pandemics? Black women are confronting simultaneously COVID-19 and a wide spectrum of violence, of which state-sanctioned violence that gave way to the murder of Breonna Taylor and others is simply one element. They're also experiencing violence associated with inequitable economic status, access to healthcare, et cetera. The common element across these various areas is power. The power to do, the power not to respond, the power to see, the power to determine who speaks and how. Thus, when I think of COVID-19 and our current times, I think of it all as power pandemics. And I use the term pandemic as this exercise of power is widespread, affecting Black women globally. What is often not discussed when we speak of Black women and power pandemics is the grief that so many of us face and how that can cause many Black women to be in a perpetual state of mourning. And related, the politics around mourning and the intersection of race, class, and gender and sexuality remains under-theorized. Before I get a little bit deeper into the politics of mourning and what it gives us for thinking about COVID-19, I want to offer a little story that brings us to the forefront of mourning. When will the COVID be over? I wish the COVID was over, she cried in the way only a 5-year-old could, full of passion and truth. She stood outside the gate like she does every day on her way home from school, except that today COVID had disrupted their normal routine. The ringing bell, one could hear it from the back patio, signals the end of the school day. In a few minutes, she knew that the doorbell would ring. This was their Monday through Friday routine. And so she shifted and got herself ready to greet her weekday visitor. Like clockwork, her bell rang. Her hand was poised on the doorknob as she heard the chime. Standing on the other side of the gate was her little 5-year-old visitor. The friendship between these two, one 5 and the other 74, was one to behold. They often sat on a bench in the garage discussing their days. The 5-year-old sharing songs and teaching the elder all that she had learned from the day at school. Separated by age, yet close in their delight of marveling at the school day, both of them would sit here in conversation. But on this particular day, the routine was ruptured, COVID. The 5-year-old patiently waited for her elder to open the gate. Each stood looking at the other. Finally, the little girl's grandmother told her, "You know you can't hug Miss Jordan, right?" At this point, she passionately declared, "When will the COVID be over? I want this COVID to be over." Tears flowed down her little upturned face. My mother, Miss Jordan, stared at her little neighbor who had become part of her daily routine. Both lives disrupted and with no end in sight. On that day, I watched a mourning ceremony, and it made me think of how Black women stand together and separate as we mourn. And this story is captured in one of the books, books that I'm working on Black women and COVID-19. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about mourning. And Sigmund Freud talks about mourning as this, and I quote, "a reaction to the loss of a loved one or to loss of some abstraction which has taken the place of one, such as fatherland, liberty, and ideal, and so on." Freud goes on to talk about how we work through loss, which I think is so inept of thinking about how Black women in particular, quote unquote, work through loss. He said that a failure to work through loss, to refuse to detach from the lost object, results in pathology. And so Freud, if we follow his line of argument, would argue that Black women who are systematically mourning across these power pandemics would actually be displaying a form of pathology. I beg to differ. And so I want us just to take a little moment to come into the work of Jamaica Kincaid, who offers us a different way of theorizing mourning and mourning as experienced by Black folk in the diaspora. I'm not going to go through a lot of what she says, but there's this beautiful quote from her book, My Garden, and it reads, "But what am I to do with this droopy, weepy sadness in the middle of summer, with its color and shape reminding me of morning, as it does in spring remind me of morning, but mourning the death of something that happened long ago." So Black women are mourning in the midst of this pandemic what has come before us, what is happening to us, and also what might happen to us in the future. And it's in their mourning that we're able to understand a critique of structures, a critique of power. And also in their mourning, we get to see a reimagination of what power would look like. So what would happen if these power pandemics that we're experiencing were replaced by more equitable structures? How are we understanding when Black women mourn what they're telling us about power pandemics and how they're understanding equity? And so what I want us to think about is mourning as a cultural and historical process that is not only individual or psychological, but is actually collective and historical. And it actually provides us with a different set of information on not only what Black women are experiencing, but also how they're imagining a future. So mourning gives us a place of connectivity, a mode of connectivity across diverse experiences, for example. And so mourning is not pathological, as we are apt to believe, especially if we put it in the context of Blackness experiencing power pandemics over time. Instead, mourning, I argue, should be read as a critique. And so thank you. At this point, I will open us up for questions and fantastic conversations. And I saw briefly that Dr. Spence has joined us. So from the audience, let's start with the audience. If there are any questions, concerns, anything you want us to dig into a little bit more. Yeah. All right, so I took some notes so I can get us going while others think about what we did within a 10-minute frame. And so over the course of this conversation, we have been asked, how do we think about, for example, what the Black church would look like post-COVID? What is the role of the Black church as an institution? Is a question posed by Dr. Tucker-Worgs. Dr. Brown-Dean has really forced us to think about this notion of returning to normal by suggesting that normal never really existed for Black folk. And what does that mean for education, vaccines, and particularly for the capital needed to rebuild, right? Because there's all this notion of how we're rebuilding. But more importantly, she raises this question around vulnerability. And that story you told of the 20-year-old who claimed agency and said, either which way I'm at risk. And so therefore I opt to choose how I'm going to be at risk is such a powerful testimony for understanding how Black folk are moving through these power pandemics. Dr. Spence asked us to think about the neoliberal turn. With this focus, there are lots in there to think about, but what stood out to me is labor organizing and what happens when we're in the gig economy and there is no space for organizing. What happens to these workers? How are they able then to protect themselves? And to borrow back from, I believe it was Dr. Brown-Dean quoted the prior Surgeon General, Do It for Big Mama. One of the pieces in the book I'm working on talks about that and uses that and inverts it and say, well, you need to listen to Big Mama because clearly Black women know what to do during pandemics and you all don't. Right? Really fascinating, the argument that she's making. And so all of these questions are here on the table, right? When we think about how do we move forward when we're able to make it out of this pandemic. And so I was hoping that we could maybe as folk try to jump in with their thoughts, if the panelists would give a sense, or if, I know that Lester, you had another program, but how are you responding to each other? How are you seeing this conversation across? I mean, really, everybody took a completely different approach here in thinking about COVID-19 and begin to paint a fuller picture. So how are you all talking to each other? How are you responding to what was shared and the richness that was shared on this panel?
One thing that stands out to me, we have been in a time where people are anti-organization, anti-institution, anti-structure. And one of the things that we have learned throughout this pandemic is just how important those Indigenous organizations and institutions are. So that when people couldn't get access to PPP loans for their businesses, it was community-based mutual aid organizations that helped people keep their doors open and often help people stay in their homes or get access to food. It was church-based food pantries that had a relationship. Right before this call, I was on a COVID-19 task force call, and the issue about, we sort of engage in this gaslighting that Black folks were just afraid of the vaccine without first acknowledging that concern was valid based on what has been done, but also it's about an issue of access, that when people demonize communities and only want to come to them when they can get ahead and getting access to vaccines, how those institutions that have built relationships are important. And I think in thinking about Dr. Spence's work as well, what are those organizations and spaces that are led by Black people that understand those needs and are able to resist some of the efforts to bastardize what their purpose is and how we move forward. And I think whether we are talking about churches, we are talking about unions, we are talking about co-ops that people have, or even homeschool associations for people to educate their children with a curriculum that affirms them and doesn't stigmatize them, that broader conversation, I think, needs to be had.
Anybody else wants to jump in?
I will. I think I was thinking, and to, maybe to build on what Khalila just was saying, but thinking about how do we come out, and both of you, Julia and Khalila, how do we come out of the, so that normal, so going back to normal is not the preferred option. And so we do want to get past, the virus and just the threat of becoming ill and dying and our loved ones that happened to them. But we don't want to go back to where we were. Obviously, we want to be able to, like you were saying, Julia, dream of better futures. We want to be able to enact them, right? And so I want us to think about the ways that, what we're going through, how we can, and what we've done to adjust and adapt can inform our futures, what we might do on the other side. And so I was thinking about like the Black churches. They have been, a genius at reinvention. They've shifted, changed, and I think it based, to address or to respond to the social and political context. So with the storefront churches, developing out of the migrants going to the cities, right? And so these churches developed, to address their spiritual needs, but also help the people to assimilate to city life, right? So, but they shifted and changed. And so how do we change, to address the new reality, but in a good way, because change can be bad or good. We can hold on to some of the not so good traditions, say in the Black church, like the prosperity gospel or whatever, but how do we shift and move us towards a situation where these institutions help us to get closer to liberation? That was a long way to say that, but dreaming of new futures. And so I'm thinking about that as a way that the presentations kind of tie together.
Thank you. I love that, this notion of dreaming of new futures, right? And thinking about organizing and what does organizing look like across a wide spectrum. So from providing food to providing PPE, which brings me to Lester. I don't know if you were able to hear some of what was discussed prior to you being here, or I don't know how you want to come in, but feel free. You're muted. I'm
glad I heard some of it. Otherwise, I'd just shut up. But I'd like to make two interventions. So there are a number of people in the chat, and I wish that we had a framework where we could actually see people in the chat as opposed to this structure. This structure kind of sucks. But I'm gonna give a shout out to two folk who do work that are related to this, that just come up. One is Sally Nuama. She actually does work looking at how kind of poor and working class folk, focusing on sisters, actually kind of participate even in the face of significant burden. So one thing to think about is how gender, race, and class come together to create the conditions for certain types of subjugation at the same time as a certain types of resistance. The second person is Jordan-Zachary. Jordan is one of Tamelyn's former colleagues. And Jordan was writing about Octavia Butler long before folks are writing about Octavia Butler. And I think that Octavia Butler, people are looking at Octavia Butler's work, but I'd be interested in hearing Jordan talk about how in fundamental ways, Octavia Butler got this moment right, but also got it wrong. Mm-hmm. She got it wrong in that her whole idea in the parable of talents is that Black folk have to, or resistance was found outside of the city. And the city was a place of fundamental dysfunction, where what we can argue is that the city has been the source in this moment of profound political resistance, right? So that alternative future that Tamelyn is talking about in ways is an urban future, even though that's complicated. And then finally, your own work, Julia, you're talking about mourning. I'm giving a paper, I think tomorrow, the days blend, on against hope. We've been looking to hope for a while. And now that behavioralists are able to study affect in addition to other variables, like my man, Davin Phoenix, he's written a book about how powerful hope is for political engagement among Black folk. And Davin, that work is dope, but I think that argument is actually whack. Not Davin, not he's my man. But if you think about how affect works in Black communities, I would suggest that the sentiment that comes from mourning and anger means far more to Black political participation and resistance than hope does. Hope is a deeply liberal, quote unquote, integrationist affect. And it works in some ways, but I think that in the moment we're talking about, I would love for us to think through how mourning is, because it's not pathological. Anger is not pathological. I don't know any people who went to the polls to vote against Trump because they were hopeful. I knew all types of people who went to the polls to vote against Trump and engaged in a number of other things because they were pissed as hell. You know, how do we think about that? So
So I'm glad you brought Devin up, because he and I have been having these little conversations, and I gave a talk. Time seems so warped in my mind right now about this notion of hesitant hope, right? That when you can't just put Black folk in this category of hope, because it really doesn't capture a lot of what I think Black folk are experiencing. There's always a little bit of hesitancy to the hope. And that hesitancy is caused by anger and is caused by mourning, a perpetual state of mourning, right? And so I've been arguing all through this pandemic is, when will Black women be allowed to mourn? Because we are tasked with working. But mourning requires us sometimes, and Lester, you and I have to have a little bit more conversation about work, because mourning requires us to take a little bit of time. In most societies, when you mourn, you have to take time. But our lives are so constrained by power that we cannot afford to take that time to fully mourn. Right. So even though I'm talking about mourning, I even recognize that there are limits to our possibilities of mourning. Right, because we have to get up the next day. Like Khalila, not to put you on the spot, but you mentioned, you know, your daughter is at school during this time, right? I'm like, and I smile and I'm like, I'm grateful I don't have little people during this time, because I don't know how I would have done it. I've had to take moments to just sit down and be like, whoa, child.
I'm no longer married. I was raising my 3 youngest children simultaneous. So the full time from March until August, I was raising my 3 youngest children alone. You know, that was the only reason I was able to do it without breaking something is because I had the semester off already. But that is so, it's so real. And you're right. It's like folks are starting to theorize fugitivity. Like you think about Neil Roberts' work on marriage, it's like, what does that space in between look like? Where we have to get at least some respite or something in order to kind of do the mundane work, much less the resistance or rebellion or other types of work.
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
I would just say that I think that again speaks to the notion of vulnerability that we talk about in our work. You know, a lot of people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. We believe that Black folks are subjected to perpetual traumatic stress disorder. And we know that all of that has effects not just on your mental health, but also your physical health. And that's the Ruthie Wilson Gilmore piece about Black people, because of racism, are naturally more susceptible to premature death. It is what Toni Morrison says, that the function of racism is to distract you from the work. And the work, not in the traditional sense that we think of it, I got to get this paper done, I have to grade these papers, I have to get the laundry done, but the work that we need to define for ourselves on our own terms. And without that space, you know, I think we're doing an okay job of figuring out what people need right now, addressing those basic needs. I have a real concern about what this will look like a year from now. Scientists are already telling us that there will be an impact on the life expectancy rates of Black people, particularly living in conditions where they are already vulnerable. What does this look like a year from now, 5 years from now? And how do we address that while also understanding that the next pandemic will come whether we are ready for it or not?
So let's talk about, you know, let's put on, for a lack of a better term, recognizing what Lester said about Octavia Butler, but let's put on let's look into the future hat. What is the future for Black politics post-COVID? What does that look like in our churches, in our schools, within labor? What are you all imagining? What's making you smile and what's making you go, I don't know? Right? What are you thinking?
This is like class where everybody figures out who's going to speak first. I'll throw this out there. What is making me imagine things differently is hearing from young people who are saying enough. You don't get to talk about us. You don't get to legislate about us if you're not with us and for us. And I think that will be something that we have to address generationally, what the path forward will look like, whether that was young people putting their lives on the line and their bodies on the line during many of these protests and uprisings, pointing out the hypocrisy of sending the DEA to a Black Lives Matter rally, but not having enough law enforcement January 6th at the Capitol when violent, racist, treasonous people were engaging in an insurrection. That's the piece that I think the voices of young people, their activism. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm getting ready to go back home. I haven't seen my in-laws since 2019. There's now has to be a discussion about reclaiming our rural roots and what that looks like for us to produce what we need and not be dependent on other people to do that for us.
Well said.
I think what makes me hopeful, even just doing this survey that Dawn and I did, and looking at these churches and some of the things that they said they were doing and embracing about Black Lives Matter, that I don't think would have happened a year ago or 2 years ago. So even though, so that they, and so C. Eric Lincoln and Larry Bemia wrote a book, important book about Black churches. And one of the things they said was that the civil rights movement fundamentally changed the Black church. And so that not every church, I'm not talking about monolithic church, but that it made the church, it shifted the church to be more prophetic, more progressive, more, and have as a part of their repertoire of actions, direct action. And you saw that more after the civil rights movement. So that I'm hoping that after COVID, we could, that the church will shift to become more inclusive. I don't know if this more more prophetic, more moving us towards kind of liberation, less homophobic, less sexist, those kinds of things. So it's not a magic one. I don't know how that's going to happen, but I'm thinking there are some indications. Even Reverend Lewis yesterday on the activist panel, who was talking about social to polls, I think he said this there. I've been listening to him various places, but at some point he said what they did, mobilizing all those voters in Milwaukee, wouldn't have happened before, before the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, or before, even before the pandemic. So that hopefully this moment will teach us something that will push us along in a better direction.
Hey, Tamelyn, did you see Hoda's question in the chat?
No, I didn't.
Are Black churches gearing up for the frontal attack on them by the Republicans?
Do you want to talk? Are you talking about what did you just say, Lester?
So the question, are Black churches gearing up for the frontal attack on them by the Republicans? That's her question.
Oh, are Black, I think that Black churches vary, but I do think that some churches, like I've been very impressed by the AMEs in the Second Episcopal District. They are so sophisticated in how they are thinking about politics. And so, they're thinking about it in ways that I didn't really expect until, talking and really, looking at them. And so I wouldn't say across the board, no, but I think that there are some who are, and hopefully they will kind of serve as models for others.
So we have 1 last minute. Lester, all yours.
No, it's all yours. I wouldn't hear long.
So we've been given a lot to think about, from the role of organizing to the role of emotion in politics. and also these questions about what the future looks like or can look like, and the positionality of Blackness in shaping a future. And so my big takeaway, and I encourage you all in the audience, et cetera, to really think about your big takeaway and how it's calling you to action, is really to think very passionately about how we begin to organize to make real a future that we can see and that we want to live in. Whereas Khalila said that we're not waiting for people, and I'm paraphrasing here, waiting for people to serve us, but we are serving ourselves. All right? And that to me is a beautiful future to imagine. So thank you all for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing so beautifully your thoughts. Hopefully next year I will see you all in person. Wherever we're gonna be, I'm gonna be. And so in the meantime, be well, wear your mask, take care so that we can gather together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
All right, be well.
Yeah, everyone.